The lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel glittered with Christmas lights, casting amber reflections across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Daniel Carter stood near the concierge desk, adjusting the name tag on his navy vest, the uniform issued to maintenance staff working the holiday shift. His shift supervisor had promised time and a half for anyone willing to cover Christmas week, and Dan needed every extra dollar. Emma's preschool tuition had gone up again, and the radiator in their apartment had started making that grinding sound that meant expensive repairs were coming. He'd just finished checking the service elevator on the third floor when he returned to the lobby, making a mental note to order replacement cables before the holiday shutdown. The gala was in full swing now. Chicago's wealthiest gathered in their designer gowns and $1,000 suits. Dan had learned to make himself invisible at these events, moving through the edges of rooms where the staff corridors met the public spaces, fixing what needed fixing without disturbing the guests who paid more for one night here than he made in a month. A woman in a white blazer dress seized his collar. Her blonde hair was twisted into a low bun, her eyes frantic yet cold with determination. The words came fast, urgent. "Pretend to be my husband, right now." Before Dan could process the request, before he could ask who she was or what kind of trouble she was running from, she pulled him close and kissed him. The lobby fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A champagne glass clinked against marble somewhere to his left, the sound sharp in the sudden quiet. Across the room, a man in an expensive suit froze, his face draining of color. Preston Blackwood, though Dan didn't know the name yet, looked like someone had just rearranged his chessboard without permission. The woman's fingers dug into Dan's collar, trembling. Not theatrical trembling for the audience, but the real thing, the kind that came from a nervous system in full revolt. She broke the kiss and grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the service hallway. Dan's mind raced through scenarios. Was she running from an abusive partner? A stalker? Was she about to rob him in some elaborate scheme? His wallet held $43 and a photo of Emma, nothing worth stealing. But he followed because something in her eyes looked like the emergency room, like the moment before everything falls apart, and Dan had been trained to recognize that look. The elevator doors closed behind them with a soft chime. The sudden silence was deafening. Victoria Sterling leaned against the wall, breathing like she'd just run a marathon. Up close, without the lobby lights and the audience, she looked younger, more fragile. The CEO mask was cracking. Dan finally found his voice. "What are you doing?" She pressed her palms against her eyes, words coming in gasps between breaths. "I'm sorry, I just saw him and I panicked." "Saw who?" "My ex-fiancé. He's been following me for weeks. When I saw him tonight, I needed to do something that would throw him off. Something he wouldn't expect." Her hands lowered, eyes red-rimmed. "So you kissed a complete stranger?" "Yes, and I know that's insane, but I was out of options, and you were there, and you've always been kind to me." Dan's forehead creased. "We've never met." 3 weeks ago, the parking garage. You held the elevator door without being asked. You didn't try to make conversation. You didn't stare at me like I was a prize to be won. You just stood there quietly, then nodded and disappeared. The memory surfaced. A blonde woman in a business suit, phone pressed to her ear, rushing toward the closing elevator doors. Dan had caught them, held them open, received a brief, grateful nod. He hadn't thought about it since. It was just the thing you did. Victoria's voice cracked. "That kiss wasn't for the crowd, it was for me. If I hadn't done something, anything, I would have frozen. Marcus would have seen me freeze, and he would have known I'm scared of him." She straightened against the wall, trying to pull the CEO back together. "I can't let him win, not tonight." Dan recognized the edge she was standing on. He'd stood there himself in the hospital corridor 3 years ago, in the funeral home, in the dark hours after Emma finally fell asleep asking when Mommy was coming home. This woman was drowning, and drowning people didn't make rational choices. They grabbed whatever was floating by. 10 minutes, Victoria said. "Just stand next to me for 10 minutes. Let him see that I'm not alone." Dan thought about Sophie waiting at Mrs. Chen's apartment, about the overtime pay sitting in his future, about every sensible reason to walk away from whatever mess this woman was dragging behind her. Then he thought about the way she'd looked at him in that elevator 3 weeks ago, like he was a person instead of furniture, like his small kindness had mattered. The words came out before he could stop them. 10 minutes. They stepped back into the lobby like actors taking the stage. Victoria's hand slid into the crook of Dan's elbow, her fingers digging in slightly. The crowd had mostly returned to their conversations, but heads still turned. Whispers rippled through the room like wind through wheat. They crossed toward the ballroom entrance where a small group had gathered around the man who'd been watching from across the lobby. Preston Blackwood was tall, silver creeping into his temples, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Dan's car. His eyes tracked Victoria's approach with predatory focus, the kind of look Dan had seen on men who believed the world owed them something. Preston's voice came smooth as oil. "Victoria, I didn't realize you'd be bringing a guest." Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Preston, I didn't realize you'd be here at all. The Grant Group invited me personally." The threat was casual, conversational. "How interesting that you're suddenly so concerned about my business relationships." His gaze slid to Dan, dismissive, the way people looked at service workers they didn't consider quite human. "Though I see your taste in companions hasn't improved." Victoria's grip tightened and something in Dan shifted. He'd spent 3 years making himself small, invisible, forgettable. But this man had just looked at him like he was disposable, and Dan had been looked at that way too many times. By Sarah's parents who'd never thought he was good enough. By the administrators at Emma's first preschool who'd suggested a single father might not be the best environment. By every person who'd ever equated his blue collar with a blue mind. Dan extended his hand with confidence he didn't feel. "Daniel Carter." The next word dropped like a stone into still water. "Victoria's husband." Preston stared. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. "Husband," he repeated flatly. "That's right. We've been married about a year now." Dan glanced at Victoria, committing to the lie. "Isn't that right, honey?" Victoria's response came without hesitation. "A year and 2 months. We had a small ceremony, very private." Preston's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the perfectly shaved skin. How convenient that no one knew about this. Dan kept his voice steady, channeling every ounce of calm he'd learned from diffusing Emma's tantrums and dealing with angry hotel guests. "We didn't see the need to make an announcement. Some things are worth keeping between the people who matter." The older couple Preston had been talking with were staring openly now, their expressions shifting to something like approval. A woman in a red dress actually smiled at Victoria, raising her champagne glass in a small salute. It was working. Preston looked like a man whose carefully laid plans had just been set on fire. Victoria guided Dan away with practiced grace. "If you'll excuse us, we should say hello to the Grant Morrison Group representatives." They didn't make it far. Victoria's composure lasted until they reached the service corridor, then shattered like fine crystal. She pushed through a door marked staff only into a small break room where fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the coffee maker burbled in the corner. 3 steps inside, her knees buckled. Dan caught her elbow, guided her to a plastic chair. She sat heavily, breathing in short gasps. He filled a paper cup with water from the cooler, brought it back, then draped his maintenance jacket over her shoulders. The weight of it seemed to ground her, pulling her back from whatever edge she'd been approaching. Her breathing started to slow. Dan had worked as an EMT for 2 years after high school, before Sarah got pregnant and he'd needed steadier income. He recognized the signs of a panic attack. Shallow breathing, trembling hands, that look in the eyes like the floor had just disappeared. He'd learned the grounding techniques. Physical weight helped. Cold water helped. A calm voice helped. When Victoria finally looked up, the CEO was gone. What remained was just a woman who'd been running on empty too long. Her voice came small, almost ashamed. "I'm sorry. You have to see this." "See what? A human being having a human reaction?" Dan sat across from her. "You just walked into a room with a guy who's been stalking you and lied to his face. Most people would need a minute. Most people don't have to lie about being married to a stranger they assaulted in a hotel lobby." Despite everything, there was humor in her voice, dark and self-deprecating. Dan found himself almost smiling. "Calling yourself my husband might be the nicest thing anyone said to me in months. We'll call it even." Victoria laughed, a broken sound that was half sob. Under the fluorescent lights, Dan could see the exhaustion written into her face, the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her jaw. She looked like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to put down the weight she was carrying. "How long has he been doing this?" Dan asked. "6 months, since I called off the wedding." Victoria stared at the water cup. "At first, just phone calls. Then he started showing up places. My office, my coffee shop, the gym at 5 in the morning. He never does anything illegal. Nothing I could get a restraining order for. He just appears. That's called stalking. That's called being strategic." Her voice turned bitter. "Preston doesn't make mistakes. Meanwhile, he's been systematically dismantling everything I've built, talking to board members, spreading rumors, positioning himself as the stable alternative to the emotional woman who can't even maintain a relationship." Dan leaned forward. "He's threatened by you." Victoria blinked. "What?" "That's why he's doing this. He can't handle that you're better than him. So he's trying to make you small enough to control." Her expression shifted, something unlocking behind her eyes. "No one's ever put it that way before. Maybe no one's been looking at it right." They sat in silence for a moment. Beyond the door, the gala hummed on, champagne corks popping and laughter echoing off marble. Victoria stood slowly, shoulders straightening, and Dan watched the CEO slide back into place. The transformation was impressive and a little sad, like watching someone put on armor they'd been wearing so long it had fused to their skin. "I need to ask you something," Victoria said, "and you're absolutely allowed to say no." Dan had a feeling he knew where this was going. "How many minutes are we talking about now?" "More than 10. She pulled his jacket tighter around her shoulders. "The Grant Morrison Group partnership is contingent on board approval. My board is split between members who trust me and members who think Preston might be right about my instability." She took a breath, and Dan saw it cost her something to admit this next part. "If I walk out there alone, if they see Preston rattled me, they'll start second-guessing. But if you walk out there with me, married, they'll see a woman who's moved on, who's stable." Victoria's voice dropped, raw with desperation. "I know this is insane. I know I have no right to ask. But I need you, Daniel. Not just for 10 minutes, for the rest of tonight, maybe the next few days until the contracts are signed and Preston can't touch them." Dan thought about Emma waiting at Mrs. Chen's, about his 3 boss and his carefully balanced life, about the fact that he'd built an existence around being invisible, controllable, safe. Getting involved in this woman's war with her ex-fiancé was the opposite of safe. It was chaos waiting to happen. But then he thought about the way Victoria had looked when her knees buckled, about the bruise he'd glimpsed on her wrist when her sleeve had ridden up, a small dark mark that looked suspiciously like fingerprints, about the fact that for 3 years he'd been so busy surviving that he'd forgotten what it felt like to do something that mattered. "I'm a maintenance worker," he said. "I don't know anything about your world. I'm going to mess this up." Victoria handed back his jacket. "You already saved me once tonight. When you called yourself my husband, you didn't hesitate. You just knew what I needed. That's not something I can teach someone. That's just who you are." She straightened, checking her reflection in the dark window. "I won't pressure you. If you say no, I'll walk out there alone. But if you say yes, I'll make sure you're compensated." It was the last part that got him. The assumption that he'd want money, that helping her was a burden to be paid for and forgotten. Like she couldn't imagine someone would help just because she needed it. Dan kept his voice steady. "Keep your money. If I do this, I'm not doing it for a paycheck." "Then why would you do it?" 3 years ago, a nurse named Patricia had held his hand in the hospital and told him he didn't have to face the worst night alone. She'd sat with him while Emma colored pictures in the waiting room, not knowing her mother was gone. Patricia had brought him coffee and let him cry without judgment, and she'd never asked for anything in return. Dan had never forgotten that kindness. "Because nobody should have to deal with this alone," he said simply. Victoria's eyes went bright with tears. She blinked back. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." They made the rounds. Victoria introduced Dan to what felt like 100 people whose names he immediately forgot. He shook hands, smiled, and tried not to think about how his shoes compared to everyone else's. The Grant Morrison Group representatives were easier than expected. Richard and Patricia Morrison asked where they'd met, how long they'd known each other, what Dan did for work. Victoria had coached him quickly in the hallway. Keep it simple. Keep it close to truth. They'd met at the hotel, had known each other 6 months, and he worked in building operations. All technically accurate if you squinted hard enough and didn't ask follow-up questions. Patricia Morrison looked at him for a long moment with knowing eyes. Well, it's lovely to meet you, Daniel. Preston kept his distance most of the night, but Dan could feel him watching. Around 11 o'clock, Preston finally approached again. He'd had more drinks, his smile loose and dangerous. I have to hand it to you, Victoria. This is impressive. Preston's words slurred slightly at the edges. How much are you paying him? Victoria's hand tightened on Dan's arm. Excuse me? Come on, a maintenance worker who just happens to be conveniently available to play husband? Preston laughed, cold and sharp. How much? 10,000? 20? I'll double it if you walk away right now. Dan felt Victoria start to pull away, like she was going to run. Without thinking, he turned and pulled her close, one hand cupping her face the way he'd seen in movies, the way Sarah used to like when she needed reassurance. His voice carried just loud enough for Preston and the nearby guests to hear. I'm not here for money. I'm here because my wife asked me to be, and I choose her over your best offer every single day. Then he kissed her. Not like the desperate lobby kiss that had started this. This one was softer, deliberate, a choice instead of a panic. When he pulled back, Victoria was staring at him with wide eyes. Preston looked slapped. Several people nearby had gone quiet, watching. Dan kept his gaze on Victoria. Ready to go home? She nodded, mute. They left Preston standing there like a statue of defeat. In the elevator, Victoria finally spoke. You didn't have to do that. Yeah, Dan said. I did. The next morning, Dan's phone started ringing at 6:30. He'd just dropped Emma at preschool when the calls began, unknown numbers with local area codes flooding his screen. He ignored the first three, but when his manager at the hotel texted, he pulled over in the Grand Meridian parking lot. The message was short. You need to see this. A link followed. Dan's thumb hovered over it for a moment before he clicked through. The article loaded slowly on his crappy phone, images appearing in chunks. The headline made his stomach drop. Mystery man steals hearts at Sterling Capitol Gala. Below was a photo of him and Victoria in the lobby, right after that first kiss. His hand on her waist, her fingers clutching his collar, both of them looking like the world had just stopped spinning. The article was mostly speculation about Victoria's secret marriage, questioning where this mysterious husband had come from and why no one had known about him. But the comments section was uglier. People questioning whether he was real, whether he was paid, whether Victoria was so desperate she'd hired an actor. Someone had already dug up information about his 3 jobs, posting it with sneering commentary about gold diggers and opportunists. Another commenter had found the building he lived in, pointing out that it was subsidized housing for low-income families. Dan's phone rang again. Victoria this time. Have you seen the news? Just reading it now. Victoria's voice came tight with stress. I'm so sorry. My PR team is drafting a statement, but I wanted to warn you before Preston goes after you. Before what? Before he tries to discredit both of us. He's already making calls telling people you're an opportunist, that I'm paying you. Dan sat in his car, watching morning traffic stream past on Michigan Avenue. He thought about his quiet life, his 3 bums, Emma's routine, the careful invisibility he'd built over the past 3 years. All of it potentially crashing down because he'd agreed to help a stranger. The smart thing would be to walk away. Tell Victoria it was a mistake. Wish her luck. Go back to being nobody. But the memory of that bruise on her wrist kept nagging at him, and the way she'd looked when her knees had buckled, and the fact that Preston Blackwood was exactly the kind of man who needed to lose. What do you need me to do? The silence lasted so long he thought the call had dropped. Then Victoria said, voice rough with emotion, What? You're fighting this guy for your company. I already said I was in. So what do you need? Daniel, you don't understand. Preston is going to dig into your life, your work history, your family. He's going to try to find anything he can use. Dan surprised himself with how calm he sounded. So let him dig. I've got nothing to hide. I work 3 jobs. I'm raising my daughter alone. And I live in a two-bedroom apartment. If that's not good enough for Preston Blackwood, then Preston Blackwood can go to hell. Victoria laughed, shaky with relief. His phone buzzed with more calls. 6 missed calls now, 3 voicemails. I'm getting a lot of attention, Dan said. Don't answer them. I'm sending security and a lawyer just in case. Victoria paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. And Daniel? Thank you. Again. The security guy arrived within an hour. Davis was former police, early 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put Dan at ease. The lawyer showed up that afternoon. Jennifer Torres was sharp-eyed and sharper dressed, carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than Dan's monthly rent. Jennifer asked 1,000 questions about his background while Davis stood watch by the window. Criminal record? None. Credit history? Decent, aside from those late rent payments 2 years ago when Sarah's medical bills had piled up. Work history? Stable? 3 jobs, but all legitimate? Any disputes with anyone? No. Any skeletons in the closet? Just grief and guilt, but those weren't illegal. They built the story carefully. Met 2 months ago when Victoria had an issue with her building's HVAC system, and Dan had been called in as a consultant. Started talking, then dating, then fell in love fast. Small courthouse wedding 3 weeks ago, kept private after the disaster with Preston. Simple, believable, utterly fake, but the more they rehearsed it, the more real it felt in Dan's mouth. They discovered actual common ground. Both early risers, both liked coffee black, both had complicated relationships with parents. Victoria's father had built Sterling Capital from nothing and never forgiven her for being better at running it. Dan's father had left when he was 12, and his mother had spent his childhood reminding him he was the reason. We're both people who learned young that love comes with conditions, Victoria said that evening after Emma had gone to bed at Mrs. Chen's. Dan looked at her across the small table in his apartment where Jennifer had insisted they practice their story one more time. What are your conditions? She considered the questions seriously. Competence, control, never needing help. Those aren't conditions, Dan said. Those are defense mechanisms. Victoria smiled sadly. What are yours? That I'll eventually let everyone down. He said it simply, a fact accepted years ago. My wife died because I was late. 10 minutes late picking her up. So she drove herself and the accident happened. If I'd been on time, Victoria interrupted. Accidents are accidents because they're not anyone's fault. Tell that to the part of my brain that runs through the scenario every night. They sat in silence. Outside, Chicago traffic hummed past, indifferent to their small tragedies. By Thursday, Dan was exhausted. Emma had been asking questions he didn't know how to answer. Why was Daddy on the internet? Why were people taking pictures? Why did that lady say mean things about them on TV? Victoria called that afternoon. I need you to come to my apartment. Preston showed up at my office. Security escorted him out, but he's making threats. I'd feel better if you were here. Dan looked at Emma, coloring happily at the kitchen table. I've got Emma with me. Silence, then, bring her. Victoria's penthouse overlooked Lake Michigan from the 43rd floor. The kind of place Dan had only seen in magazines, all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture that looked uncomfortable but probably cost a fortune. Davis rode up with them in the elevator. Emma stared wide-eyed at all the buttons. This is like a castle, Emma whispered. Victoria met them at the door in jeans and a sweater, her hair down, face free of makeup. She looked younger this way and terrified when she saw Emma. She crouched down to the little girl's level. Hi, I'm Victoria. What's your name? Emma's shyness lasted about 3 seconds. Emma Elizabeth Carter. I'm 4 3/4. 4 3/4 is a very good age. Victoria's smile was genuine, reaching her eyes for the first time since Dan had met her. I'm 32 and approximately 6 months. Emma giggled. Dan watched them, something tight in his chest loosening just slightly. They went inside. The apartment was enormous and somehow still felt cold, but Victoria had made an effort. Coloring books and crayons on the coffee table, pizza boxes. She looked at Dan nervously. I wasn't sure what she'd like. The internet said kids like pizza. The internet was right. Emma ran to the windows, pressing her hands against the glass. Daddy, look, you can see the whole world. Victoria stood next to Dan, shoulders almost touching. The lawyer wants to meet tomorrow to go over the story, make sure we're aligned on details. What kind of details? How we met, when we got married, where we live. She glanced at him. That last one's tricky. Preston knows where I live. He's going to question why my husband isn't living here. Dan had been expecting this. So I move in for appearances until the contracts are signed. 2-3 weeks. What do I tell my daughter? Victoria turned to face him. The truth? That you're helping a friend. She's 4. She's going to ask questions. Then we'll answer them. Victoria's voice was steady, but Dan could see the fear in her eyes. I promise I'll do everything to make sure Emma's comfortable. She can have her own room, whatever you need. What Dan needed was for his life to make sense again. But that ship had sailed the moment he'd agreed to 10 minutes in a hotel lobby. Okay, he said. 2 weeks. Victoria's shoulders sagged with relief, but Dan wasn't finished. That bruise on your wrist at the gala. Victoria stiffened, defensive. I told you, I'm clumsy. I was an EMT for 2 years after high school. Dan kept his voice gentle but firm. That's a grab mark. Someone grabbed your wrist hard enough to bruise. Recently. The silence stretched between them. In the living room, Emma was making airplane sounds as she colored. Victoria's admission came quietly. 3 weeks ago, Preston cornered me in the parking garage. He grabbed my wrist, asked me to reconsider, said we could still fix this. She pulled away, got to her car, drove away. She didn't report it because it was her word against his, and Preston was very good at making sure there were no witnesses to his worst moments. Dan felt anger rising in his chest, hot and unfamiliar. He'd spent 3 years keeping his emotions carefully controlled, everything measured and safe. But this was different. This was a man terrorizing a woman, using his power and her fear to control her. If he touches you again, he won't, Victoria interrupted. Not with you here. That's the point, isn't it? Dan realized. I'm not just for show. I'm a bodyguard too. Victoria's eyes watered. I didn't want to ask that. You didn't have to. She pulled something from her briefcase on the counter. A manila folder thick with pages. I hired a private investigator 3 months ago, Marcus Reed, former FBI. He's been digging into Preston's finances. Dan's pulse quickened. Has he found anything? He sent his report yesterday. I haven't had time to read it yet. She looked at him. Maybe we should. They sat on the couch while Emma colored, their heads bent over 87 pages of financial analysis. Marcus Reed was thorough. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands, offshore accounts with money flowing through them like water through a sieve. Preston had been embezzling from Sterling Capital for 9 months, ever since the engagement ended. Using backdoor access he'd had as Victoria's fiancé, stealing $12.7 million so far. But there was more. Reed had flagged unusual transactions from 3 years ago. A large payment from Preston's investment fund to a consulting firm called Clearwater Solutions, LLC. That firm had hired a driver. That driver had been involved in a hit-and-run accident that was never solved. Dan's hands started to shake before his mind caught up to what he was reading. The date jumped out at him like a punch to the gut. March 15th, 2021, the same day Sarah died. What was the name of the consulting firm? His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant and hollow. Victoria read from the report. Clearwater Solutions, LLC. The room tilted slightly. Dan gripped the edge of the couch to steady himself. The police said Sarah's accident was a drunk driver. They never caught him. The car was found abandoned 3 blocks away. Victoria was staring at him, her face pale. Dan, when did your wife die? March 15th, 2021, 6:47 p.m. Marcus Reed's note at the bottom of that page seemed to glow. Clearwater Solutions appears to be a shell company for hire, used for corporate espionage and special projects. Possible illegal activities including intimidation and worse. Preston knew your wife? Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. I don't know. Dan's throat felt tight. But I'm going to find out. Victoria was already pulling out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. 3 years ago, what was Sterling Capital working on? She pulled up archived emails and documents on her laptop. We were bidding on the Langston real estate portfolio, Preston's firm was bidding against us. We won. The pieces were falling into place. Horrible and inevitable. That deal made Sterling Capital what it is today. $800 million in profit. Sarah had worked as a paralegal at Brennan and Associates. Brennan and Associates had been Sterling Capital's legal counsel for the Langston deal. Sarah would have had access to the building, maybe even to some confidential documents if she'd been working late. Victoria found the connection in her old records. Your wife's firm handled our legal work for Langston. Dan felt like he was watching this happen to someone else. She didn't even work on corporate deals. She did family law. She helped people with custody battles and divorces. Preston wouldn't have known that, Victoria said. He would have just seen someone with access, someone who could be intimidated or... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Or eliminated. Dan completed it for her, his voice flat and dead. Emma called from across the room, oblivious. Daddy, come see what I drawed. Dan stood mechanically, walked over to admire Emma's picture of a castle with 3 stick figures in front. That's beautiful, sweetheart. That's you and me and Victoria, Emma explained proudly. Dan's vision blurred. He excused himself, walked to the bathroom, and stood with his hands braced against the sink. 3 years he'd spent believing Sarah's death was random bad luck. A drunk driver, a tragic accident, one of those senseless things that happen in a city of 3 million people. He'd carried the guilt of being 10 minutes late, of not being there to drive her home, of letting her get into that car alone. And all along, it might have been murder. Ordered by a man who was now stalking Victoria, threatening to destroy her life the way he'd destroyed Dan's. When he came back out, Victoria was sitting with Emma, helping her color. She looked up at Dan, her eyes full of understanding and shared rage. They didn't talk about it in front of Emma. But that night, after Emma was asleep in the guest room Victoria had converted into a child's wonderland, they sat in the kitchen and made plans. Dan called Detective Morrison, the cop who'd handled Sarah's case. He explained the new lead, asked for the file to be reopened. The detective was skeptical, but agreed to look into it. Victoria pulled up Sterling Capital's records from 3 years ago. The timeline was damning. Sarah died March 15th. Sterling Capital won the Langston bid March 20th. Preston's firm lost spectacularly, and 6 months later, Preston had proposed to Victoria, a calculated move to get closer to the company he couldn't beat. He used you, Dan said. He used both of us. Victoria's jaw was tight, and he's going to pay for it. But first, they had to get through the next 2 weeks. They had to sell this marriage to the board, secure the Grant Morrison partnership, and keep Preston from destroying what was left of their lives. Only now it wasn't just about Victoria's company. It was about justice for Sarah. It was about making sure Preston Blackwood finally faced consequences for the damage he'd caused. Dan looked at Victoria across the kitchen table. We need to be careful. If Preston finds out we know, he'll disappear. Victoria finished the thought. Take the money he's stolen and run. We need to trap him first. How? Victoria's smile was cold and sharp. I have an idea. Moving took less time than expected, mainly because Dan didn't own much worth moving. His entire life fit into the back of his 10-year-old Honda. Clothes for him and Emma, a battered toolbox that had belonged to his grandfather, toys Emma couldn't sleep without, 3 photo albums. Victoria sent a car service, but Dan refused. Showing up in a town car would only fuel the gold digger narrative already spreading through social media like wildfire. Mrs. Chen stood on the sidewalk watching him load boxes, her face creased with worry. Linda Chen had lived in the apartment below Dan's for 2 years, watching Emma when Dan worked late shifts, accepting payment in home-cooked meals and occasional plumbing repairs. Danny, are you sure about this? Dan secured Emma's car seat. Not even a little bit. That woman, she's good to you? She needs help, Linda, and I said I'd help her. Linda pulled him into a hug that smelled like jasmine tea and mothballs. You're a good man, but good men get hurt too. Be careful. Emma bounced in her seat the whole drive to Victoria's building, chattering about the castle and the race car bed and whether Victoria liked dinosaurs. Dan's hands stayed tight on the wheel, his mind churning through everything that could go wrong. Preston would find out where they were living. The press would camp outside. Emma would have nightmares in an unfamiliar place. Victoria would realize she'd invited chaos into her carefully controlled world and regret the whole arrangement. The doorman at Victoria's building looked at Dan's Honda like it was leaking toxic waste, but helped carry boxes to the service elevator anyway. Davis met them on the 43rd floor, taking the heavier items while Dan carried Emma's stuffed animals. The guest room had been transformed overnight. Pink walls, educational posters about planets and animals. A bookshelf already stocked with age-appropriate literature Victoria must have ordered based on internet research. Emma's eyes went wide. "Is this all mine?" "All yours," Victoria confirmed. She'd changed into casual clothes, yoga pants, and an old Northwestern sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked more human this way, less like the Ice Queen CEO from the gala photos. "Can I put my things away?" "However you want." Emma dove into organizing her new space with the serious concentration only a 4-year-old could muster. Dan found himself standing in Victoria's kitchen, which was roughly the size of his entire previous apartment, unsure what to do with his hands. Victoria poured coffee without asking if he wanted any. "Your room is down the hall. Master suite is on the other side of the living room. Bathroom between your room and Emma's. Kitchen is always stocked, but I don't actually cook, so feel free to use it however you need." This is really happening. Apparently. Victoria handed him the coffee, their fingers brushing. "Jennifer wants us at her office at 9 tomorrow morning. PR strategy meeting. Susan Chen from my communications team will be there." Dan's phone buzzed, another unknown number. His voicemail was full of messages from reporters, bloggers, amateur detectives who thought they'd cracked the case of Victoria Sterling's mysterious husband. Marcus Sullivan had called 3 times, leaving increasingly concerned messages about whether Dan needed backup. "I should call my friend, Marcus. He's worried." Victoria nodded. "Use any room you want. Make yourself at home." The phrase felt absurd in a penthouse that probably cost more per month than Dan made in a year, but he appreciated the effort. He stepped out onto the balcony, 43 floors above Chicago, and dialed Marcus. "Jesus Christ, Danny, I've been trying to reach you for 2 days." Marcus Sullivan was 58, built like a fire hydrant, with hands scarred from 30 years working maintenance and mechanical systems. He'd taken Dan under his wing when Dan first started at the Grand Meridian, teaching him everything the vocational courses hadn't covered. How to read building blueprints, how to diagnose problems by sound, how to deal with rich people who thought shouting made things get fixed faster. "I'm okay, Marcus. Just dealing with a complicated situation." "Complicated? Kid, your face is all over the internet. People saying you're conning some billionaire. Is it true you married her?" Dan exhaled slowly. "It's complicated." "That's not an answer. I'm helping someone who needs help. That's the truth." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. This woman, she worth it? Dan thought about Victoria collapsing in that break room, about the bruise on her wrist, about the way she'd crouched down to Emma's level without hesitation. "Yeah, she is." "Then you're doing the right thing. But Danny, be careful. Rich people, they live in a different world. They got different rules." "I know." "No, I don't think you do." Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. "But if you need anything, anything at all, me and the guys are here. Tommy from electrical, Rodriguez from plumbing. We got your back." Dan felt something warm spread through his chest. He'd spent 3 years in survival mode, keeping everyone at arm's length, convinced he had to handle everything alone. But Marcus was offering support without conditions, the kind of brotherhood that didn't require explanations or justifications. "Thanks, Marcus. That means a lot. Also, you still owe me $50 from poker night." Dan laughed, surprising himself. "I'll get it to you." Sunday night they ordered Chinese food and ate it on the floor of the living room because Emma insisted it was more fun that way. Victoria attempted to use chopsticks and failed spectacularly, sending a piece of Kung Pao chicken flying across the room. Emma giggled so hard she got hiccups. Dan found himself smiling, really smiling for the first time in recent memory. But when Emma was asleep, the weight of their situation crashed back down. Victoria pulled out her laptop, showing Dan the social media trends. Someone had found his employment records, posting screenshots of his W-2 forms with his income circled in red. 28,000 from the Grand Meridian, 15,000 from the delivery service, another 8,000 from catering gigs, $51,000 total to support himself and a child in Chicago. The comments were vicious. Speculation about how much Victoria was paying him. Jokes about maintenance workers hitting the jackpot. Worse, someone had found Emma's preschool and posted the address, suggesting concerned citizens should check on the child's welfare. Dan's jaw clenched. They're talking about taking Emma. They won't. Victoria's voice was steel. Jennifer's already drafting a cease and desist for anyone who publishes Emma's personal information. We've got lawyers who specialize in this. Preston's behind it. Preston or someone working for him. He's trying to make you back out. Dan looked at the screen, at his daughter's school address posted for the world to see. He doesn't know me very well. Monday morning brought the first real test. Victoria insisted on coming with Dan to drop Emma at preschool. Photographers were already waiting when they arrived, cameras clicking as Emma climbed out of Victoria's Mercedes. Dan had wanted to take his Honda, but Victoria's security team had vetoed that plan. Too easy to follow, too vulnerable to tampering. Emma's hand tightened on Dan's. Why are those people taking pictures? Because Victoria is important, sweetie, like how princesses are in stories. Is she a princess? Victoria crouched down, ignoring the cameras. Not exactly, but I run a company that helps people with their money. That sounds boring, Victoria laughed, genuine and surprised. It really is sometimes. At the classroom door, Emma froze. Ms. Rodriguez smiled welcomingly, but Emma's grip on Dan's hand became a vice. This was new. Emma loved school, usually racing ahead to the art station or building blocks. Honey, what's wrong? Emma's whisper was almost inaudible. What if you don't come back? The words hit Dan like a physical blow. He knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. I will always come back. Always. Mommy didn't. Dan's throat closed up. They'd worked through this in therapy, or so he'd thought. Emma seemed to have processed Sarah's death as well as any 4-year-old could. But change brought fear rushing back, every new variable a potential disaster. That was different. Mommy got hurt in an accident, but I'm very, very careful. And I promise I will pick you up this afternoon at 3:30, like always. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Promise? I promise on everything I love. It took 10 more minutes of reassurance before Emma would let go of his hand. Ms. Rodriguez caught Dan's eye, her expression concerned. They'd need to schedule a meeting with the school counselor. Emma was struggling more than she was showing. Victoria didn't speak until they were back in the car. I'm making this worse for her. No, Preston is making this worse, and we're going to fix it. At Sterling Capital headquarters, Victoria's board meeting was already in session. The building was glass and steel, modern architecture designed to intimidate. Dan waited in an anteroom while Victoria faced her board of directors, but Jennifer had briefed him. The board was split, 6 members solidly in Victoria's corner, 4 neutral, 2 openly hostile. Howard Chen, one of the hostile members, had been making noise about Victoria's judgment since the engagement ended. Victoria emerged an hour later, her professional mask firmly in place but tension visible in her shoulders. Howard wants a special meeting to discuss my personal life. My father shut him down, but it's coming. Your father's on your side? My father is complicated. Victoria's smile was thin. He built this company from nothing. He expected me to take over, train me for it. But I don't think he ever really accepted that I might be better at running it than he was. They drove to Jennifer Torres' office in the Loop, where the lawyer had assembled a war room. Photographs covered one wall, timeline on another, printouts of social media posts arranged in clusters. Susan Chen from Victoria's PR team was already there, along with Marcus Reed, the private investigator. Susan cut straight to business. Preston's team is running a coordinated smear campaign. 3 different Twitter accounts posting the same talking points within minutes. Instagram influencers suddenly interested in your relationship. Someone's paying for this. Marcus Reed pulled up financial records on his laptop. I've traced some of the payments, shell company in Delaware, but the money originates from accounts connected to Preston's operation. Jennifer clicked through a presentation. Here's our counter strategy. Phase 1, controlled photo opportunities showing Daniel and Victoria as a normal couple. Phase 2, brief statement requesting privacy. Phase 3, Daniel does one interview with a local station we trust. Dan's stomach twisted. I don't want to do an interview. You need to, Susan insisted. Right now, the narrative is Victoria pays you to pretend. We need to give you a voice, make you three-dimensional. Show people the real Daniel Carter. Victoria touched his arm. Only if you're comfortable. We can find another way. Dan thought about Emma's fear that morning, about Ms. Rodriguez's concerned face, about the comments suggesting he was an unfit father. What would I even say? The truth, Jennifer advised. You work hard. You love your daughter. You fell in love with Victoria despite the complications. Keep it simple and authentic. The rest of the week fell into a surreal routine. Dan worked his morning shift at the Grand Meridian, though his manager had asked him to avoid guest-facing duties until the media attention died down. He spent afternoons with Emma, then returned to Victoria's penthouse where they'd have dinner and strategize their next moves. It felt like living in two different worlds simultaneously, neither quite real. Thursday afternoon, Victoria's shower broke. Dan heard her curse from the master bathroom, a creative string of profanity that made him smile despite everything. She emerged wrapped in a bathrobe, hair dripping. The building's maintenance team can't get here until tomorrow. I've got a video call with Hong Kong investors in 20 minutes, and I look like a drowned rat. Let me see. Dan grabbed his toolbox from the hall closet. Victoria's bathroom was marble and chrome, a study in expensive minimalism. The rainfall shower head was high-end, European, the kind of fixture that cost more than his monthly rent used to be. Water dripped steadily from the head despite the tap being fully closed. He examined the system. Your pressure balancing valve is stuck. Someone did maintenance recently and didn't reset it properly. Can you fix it? Dan pulled out his socket wrench. Water heaters in the utility closet? I think so. I've never actually looked. He found the heater tucked away behind the kitchen, a tankless system that heated on demand. The service panel was still open from recent maintenance, gas valve only partially open. Sloppy work, dangerous work actually. A partially closed gas valve could cause pressure, build up, potentially leading to leaks. Whoever serviced this didn't know what they were doing, Dan muttered. He adjusted the valve to the correct position, checked the pressure gauge, then went back to the shower. 15 minutes later, hot water flowed properly and the drip had stopped. Victoria leaned against the door frame, watching him work with something like wonder. How did you know how to do that? I've been working with HVAC and plumbing systems since I was 16. It's just mechanics. You learn how the pieces fit together, and then everything's fixable. Preston has an MBA from Harvard. He couldn't fix anything if his life depended on it. Dan packed up his tools. Different skill sets. No, Victoria's voice was firm. Better skills. You can actually solve problems instead of just talking about them. That night, James Sterling requested a meeting with Victoria. Her father rarely came to her apartment, preferring she visit his Lincoln Park mansion, so the request set off alarm bells. Dan stayed in Emma's room, reading her stories about brave princesses and clever foxes, while Victoria paced the living room waiting for her father to arrive. James Sterling was 64, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that came from building an empire through force of will. He looked at Dan with the assessing gaze of someone used to evaluating assets, then nodded once as if Dan had passed some invisible test. Mr. Carter? Sir, James turned to Victoria. We need to talk, privately. They disappeared into Victoria's home office. Dan couldn't hear the conversation, but 20 minutes later, Victoria emerged looking shaken. Her father left without another word to Dan, his expression grave. Dan waited until Emma was asleep before asking, "What did he say?" Victoria poured herself a glass of wine with hands that weren't quite steady. He knew about Preston stealing from the company. He found out 6 months ago and hired his own investigator. Why didn't he tell you? Pride. He gave Preston access to our systems when we were engaged. He approved it. This whole thing, Preston being able to embezzle millions, it happened because my father trusted him. Victoria's laugh was bitter. He didn't want me to know he'd made such a terrible mistake. How much did Preston actually take? Not 12 million, closer to 30. My father's been tracking it, building a case to have him arrested. But he's been doing it alone because he couldn't admit he'd failed. Dan absorbed this information. $30 million. That kind of theft meant serious federal prison time, which meant Preston was backed into a corner. Desperate, dangerous. Your father said something else, Victoria continued. He said desperate men do dangerous things. And he's right. Preston's not just trying to discredit me anymore. He's fighting for his freedom. The implications settled over them like a cold fog. Preston knew the walls were closing in. He'd do whatever it took to survive. And right now, Victoria and Dan were the biggest threats to his escape plan. We need to be more careful, Dan said. We need to be smarter. Victoria's eyes were hard. My father might have been building this case alone, but we're not going to. Tomorrow, I'm calling the FBI myself. If Preston's going down, it's going to be on my terms. Tuesday brought a new crisis. Dan picked Emma up from preschool to find her unusually quiet, clutching her backpack like a shield. In the car, she stared out the window without speaking. At the penthouse, she went straight to her room and closed the door. Dan found Victoria in the kitchen, preparing a snack plate with the careful precision of someone following internet instructions. Apple slices arranged in a fan, cheese cut into small cubes, crackers in a neat row. It was almost endearing how hard she was trying. Emma's upset about something. Victoria set down the knife. School? I don't know. She won't talk to me. At dinner, Emma refused to eat. Victoria tried to engage her in conversation about her day, asking about art class and recess, but Emma just pushed food around her plate. Finally, Victoria tried to help, reaching for Emma's fork. Emma's voice came sharp and angry. You're not my mom. The words hung in the air like broken glass. Victoria froze, her hand hovering over the table. Emma's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. I want to go home. I don't like it here. I don't like her. Emma pointed at Victoria, accusation and pain mixed together. You're trying to replace Mommy. Victoria looked like she'd been slapped. She pulled back, standing slowly. Emma, I would never. But Emma was already running to her room, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Dan started to follow, but Victoria caught his arm. Let me. She doesn't want to talk to you right now. I know. Victoria's voice was thick with emotion, but she needs to understand something. Dan watched Victoria walk to Emma's room, knock softly, get the expected rejection. But instead of leaving, Victoria sat down outside the closed door, back against the wall, and started talking. Emma, I want to tell you something. When I was little, my mommy died too. The crying inside the room quieted slightly. I was 6 years old. It was very scary and very sad. A long pause, then the door cracked open. Emma's tear-stained face appeared in the gap. Victoria continued, her voice steady despite the tears on her own cheeks. I'm not trying to replace your mommy. Nobody could ever do that. She was special, and she loved you too so much. Then why are you here? Because your daddy needed help with something important. And because I thought maybe we could be friends. Emma emerged fully from her room, small and vulnerable. Friends don't make daddy sad. Does your daddy seem sad to you, since we've been staying here? Emma considered this seriously. No, he smiles more now. He laughs. Victoria knelt down eye to eye with Emma. Can I tell you what I'm really scared of? Emma nodded. I'm scared that you'll never give me a chance. Because I really want to be your friend, Emma. But I can't force that. It has to be something you choose. What if you go away? Like Mommy? The real fear, finally spoken aloud. Victoria pulled Emma into a hug, and Dan watched his daughter cling to this near stranger like a lifeline. I'm not going anywhere, I promise you, Emma. I will be here as long as you want me here. Dan stood in the hallway, his heart too full for his chest. This woman he barely knew was making promises to his daughter. Promises she might not be able to keep. But she was trying. She was showing up. And Emma, who'd been so scared of losing another person she loved, was taking a chance on trusting again. Wednesday morning brought Preston's counterattack. Dan dropped Emma at school and was heading to the Grand Meridian when Victoria called, her voice tight with controlled panic. Preston's at my office, in the lobby. Security's trying to remove him, but he's threatening to go to the press. I'm 20 minutes away. He says he has documents showing I paid you $50,000, 2 days before the gala. Dan's blood ran cold. That's impossible. I know it's impossible, but he has bank transfer records. Jennifer's on her way, but Danny, if he goes public with this before we can prove they're fake, I'm coming. Hold him off. Dan made it to Sterling Capital in 15 minutes, parking illegally and jogging through the lobby. Preston Blackwood stood near the elevators, perfectly groomed in a navy suit, radiating confidence. Victoria and Jennifer faced him, security flanking them. Preston's smile was a knife edge. I'm simply requesting verification from the bank. If the transfers are legitimate, Victoria can explain them. If they're not, we'll know someone's been committing fraud. Jennifer's voice was ice. These documents are fabricated. Then the bank will confirm that, unless there's a reason you don't want them verified. Preston pulled out his phone, showing the screen to the gathering crowd. Bank transfer records, official-looking letterhead, every detail perfect except for one problem. The transfer had never happened. Dan had never received $50,000 from anyone, let alone from Victoria. How convenient, Preston continued, that Victoria Sterling finds a husband right when she needs one most. How convenient that he's broke and desperate. How convenient that no one knew about their relationship until it became useful. Dan saw Victoria's control slipping, saw her starting to lose this battle. He stepped forward. You know what's actually convenient, Preston? That you're here harassing your ex-fiancé instead of explaining to federal investigators where $30 million went. Preston's smile faltered. Yeah, we know about the embezzlement, the shell companies, the offshore accounts. We know all of it. Preston recovered quickly, but not before several board members and employees had seen him flinch. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Dan moved closer, keeping his voice calm but letting steel show through. How about we call the FBI right now? Get them down here? I'm sure they'd love to see your bank records while they show you theirs. Preston's jaw tightened. This isn't over. No, it's not, but it will be. Dan looked at Victoria. Ready to go? They left Preston standing in the lobby, his facade finally cracking. In the car, Victoria's hands shook as she buckled her seatbelt. He had real documents, official bank letterhead. How did he? Forgery. Good forgery, but still fake. Dan's mind was racing. He's escalating. That means he's scared. Or it means he's about to win. Victoria's voice broke. The board meeting is Friday. If he goes public with those documents before we can prove they're fake, Howard Chen will use it to force me out. That afternoon, they assembled the team in Victoria's penthouse. Jennifer, Marcus Reed, Susan, Davis. They spread documents across the dining table, building their case against Preston while defending against his attacks. Marcus Reed examined the forged bank records. These are professional grade. He's using serious fraud tools, but they're not perfect. Give me 48 hours, I can prove they're fake. Jennifer shook her head. We don't have 48 hours. The board votes Friday morning. So we don't play defense. Victoria stood, her spine straightening. We go on offense. Everyone looked at her. Preston wants to trap me with fake evidence. Fine. I'll trap him with the truth. I'll call him, agree to meet, offer him a way out, stepping down as CEO if he backs off. You can't actually step down, Jennifer protested. I won't have to. Victoria's smile was sharp, because Preston won't be able to resist gloating. He'll admit everything, and we'll record it. The plan took shape over the next 2 hours. Victoria would call Preston, propose a meeting at her office Thursday afternoon. Jennifer would be present as witness. Marcus Reed would install hidden cameras, recording equipment with cloud backup. The goal? Get Preston to confess to the embezzlement, the forgery, his plan to take over Sterling Capital. What's my role? Dan asked. You'll be there, Victoria decided. Preston thinks you're beneath him. He'll show off in front of you. Men like Preston can't resist proving they're smarter than everyone else. Marcus Sullivan called that evening while Dan was helping Emma with the dinner. Danny, I heard what happened at Sterling Capital today. You okay? Hanging in there? Listen, I talked to the guys. Tommy, Rodriguez, half the maintenance crew. We want you to know we got your back. This rich asshole comes after you. He's going to have to go through all of us. Dan felt his throat tighten. Thanks, Marcus. I mean it. That's what brothers do. We look out for each other. Marcus paused. Also, you still owe me $50. Dan laughed despite everything. I'll get it to you after this is over. After this is over, first round's on me. Thursday arrived with the weight of inevitability. Marcus Reed spent the morning installing cameras in Victoria's office. Tiny devices hidden in air vents and wall fixtures. 4 angles, audio backup, everything uploading to secure cloud storage in real time. Jennifer reviewed Illinois recording law one more time. Single-party consent made everything legal as long as Victoria agreed, which she had in writing. Victoria and Dan rehearsed the conversation, practicing the beats. Victoria would play defeated executive, willing to surrender if Preston backed off. Dan would be silent observer, looking worried. Preston, hopefully, would be arrogant enough to confess. Emma stayed with Mrs. Chen, who'd driven into the city specifically to help. "You be careful," Linda warned. "Men like that, when they get cornered, they get dangerous." At 1:30, Victoria called Preston. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." "Not on the phone, in person. My office, 2 Pi." Preston's laugh was cold. "Why should I meet with you?" Victoria let exhaustion color her voice. "Because you win, Preston. You win." Silence stretched over the line. Then, "I'll be there." They waited in Victoria's office, watching the clock tick toward 2. Jennifer sat in the corner with her notepad, officially present as legal counsel. Dan stood by the window, stomach churning. This was it. Everything came down to the next hour. Preston arrived exactly on time, confidence radiating from every step. He sat across from Victoria without being invited, sprawling in the chair like he already owned it. "Thank you for seeing reason." Victoria's voice was level. "Let's be clear about what this is. You wanted to talk. I'm listening. I want what's best for Sterling Capital. You want control." Preston smiled. "Same thing, isn't it?" Victoria laid the trap carefully. "The bank documents you showed me, they're fake. Prove it. You know they're fake because you made them." Preston's smile widened. "That's a serious accusation." "Not as serious as embezzling $30 million. The room temperature seemed to drop. Preston glanced at Dan with open contempt. "Does your maintenance man understand what we're discussing?" Dan stayed silent, playing his role. "You can't prove anything," Preston said to Victoria. "You think I didn't know you'd hire someone to investigate me?" "Marcus Reed is very thorough." "Reed?" Preston laughed. "That washed-up FBI has-been?" "I've known about your little investigation for weeks. I've been feeding Reed false information through his sources. Half of what he found is garbage." Victoria's shock was genuine. Dan's was too. Preston had been ahead of them, playing them, controlling the information flow. But Victoria recovered. "You're right. Reed's information wasn't perfect. That's why my father hired a second investigator, someone you didn't know about." Preston's smile faltered. Victoria slid a folder across her desk. "Shell companies, wire fraud, RICO violations. Federal case, Preston. My father's been building it for months." Preston grabbed the folder, flipped it open. His face went pale as he scanned the documents. Real documents this time. Detailed accounting of every stolen dollar. Dan finally spoke. "Tell her about Sarah Carter." Preston looked up. "Who?" "My wife, killed 3 years ago, hit-and-run driver hired by Clearwater Solutions, LLC, your shell company." You can't prove I had anything to do with that." "Then why do your financial records show a payment to Clearwater 3 days before she died?" Dan stepped closer. "Why did Clearwater hire the driver who ran her off the road?" Preston stood abruptly. "I didn't order anyone killed. I mean—" He stopped, realizing what he just admitted. Jennifer's pen scratched across her notepad, recording every word. "This is a setup," Preston said. "This is justice," Victoria corrected. "And in Illinois, single-party consent makes this recording completely legal." Preston saw the blinking light on Victoria's desk phone, the subtle indicators of the hidden cameras. His face went from pale to red with rage. "You think this is over? I'll destroy both of you. I'll drag your names through every courtroom in this country. I'll make sure Daniel Carter never sees his daughter again. That little brat will end up in foster care when I'm done." Dan moved before thinking, his fist connecting with Preston's jaw. The crack of bone on bone sounded loud in the office. Preston staggered back, blood blooming from his split lip. Jennifer stood. Daniel, no! But the damage was done. Or maybe, Dan thought, the damage was finally being repaired. Preston Blackwood had threatened Emma, had admitted to conspiracy if not direct culpability in Sarah's death, had confessed to embezzlement on camera. Security arrived within seconds, Davis and his team flooding into the office. Preston tried to push past them, but Jennifer's voice stopped him cold. Mr. Blackwood, the FBI is on their way. I'd suggest you wait here. Preston made one last play, his lawyer instincts kicking in despite the blood on his chin. Nothing I said is admissible. You can't use any of this. Actually, Jennifer held up her tablet. In Illinois, one-party consent means Ms. Sterling had every right to record this conversation. And threatening a minor? That's a separate crime. You just confessed to multiple federal offenses while being recorded legally. Preston finally understood he was trapped. Really trapped. No escape routes, no clever plays left. His empire of lies was crumbling, and he demolished it himself with his own arrogance. Federal agents arrived 10 minutes later. Preston Blackwood was arrested in Victoria's office, read his rights in front of a dozen witnesses, led away in handcuffs while employees gathered in doorways to watch. Dan saw Howard Chen among the crowd, the hostile board member, his face registering shock and grudging respect. In the aftermath, Victoria collapsed into her desk chair, adrenaline finally releasing its hold. Dan's hand throbbed where it had connected with Preston's face, already swelling. Jennifer was on the phone with prosecutors, forwarding copies of the recording, building the case that would keep Preston behind bars for years. We did it, Victoria whispered. Yeah. Dan flexed his sore hand. We did. But even in victory, Dan couldn't shake the feeling that they'd barely scratched the surface of Preston's crimes. The connection to Sarah's death was circumstantial at the best. Clearwater Solutions had hired the driver, yes, but proving Preston ordered the hit would require more evidence than they currently had. That battle would take years if it ever came to resolution at all. For now, though, they'd won. Sterling Capital was safe. Victoria's position was secure. Preston was facing federal charges that would put him away for most of a decade. The hardest part, Dan realized, was just beginning, because their arrangement had been built on a lie, held together by necessity and shared danger. Now that the danger was gone, what held them together? What happened when the fake marriage stopped being useful? Victoria looked at him across her desk, the same question in her eyes. Friday morning arrived with the weight of endings. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m., and Victoria moved through her apartment with mechanical precision, selecting the right suit, the right shoes, the right armor for battle. Except there was no battle left to fight. Preston was in federal custody. The evidence was overwhelming. The Grant Morrison partnership was secure. Dan watched her rehearse answers to questions no one would ask, her mind unable to accept that the war was over. Emma ate cereal at the kitchen counter, swinging her legs and humming a song from school, oblivious to the tension vibrating through the adults around her. You'll be fine, Dan offered. Victoria's smile was brittle. I know. But fine wasn't the problem. Victory was the problem, because victory meant the agreement ended. 2 weeks until the contracts were signed, that had been the deal. Well, the contracts would be signed today, maybe tomorrow. The timeline didn't matter. What mattered was that Dan and Emma's presence was no longer necessary. The Sterling Capital boardroom was all glass and leather, designed to intimidate. Victoria took her seat at the head of the table while Dan waited in the anteroom with Jennifer. Through the glass walls, he watched the board members file in. James Sterling, Victoria's father, sat to her right. Howard Chen, the skeptic, sat at the far end. Between them, 10 other faces Dan had studied in photographs but never met. Victoria's presentation was flawless. She explained Preston's arrest, clarified Sterling Capital's position as victim rather than accomplice, outlined the federal investigation's timeline, and presented the Grant Morrison partnership terms. Her voice never wavered. Her hands never shook. She was the CEO these people had trusted, vindicated at last. The vote was 11-1, with Howard Chen abstaining rather than supporting, but abstention was close enough to victory. Richard Morrison appeared on the video screen, congratulating Victoria on her handling of an impossible situation. The partnership was official. Sterling Capital was safe. Jennifer squeezed Dan's shoulder. It's over. Dan nodded, but over felt like the wrong word. Over-implied something finished, complete. This felt more like an interruption, a pause before the real question had to be answered. Victoria emerged from the boardroom 40 minutes later, handshakes and congratulations still echoing behind her. Her smile was professional, perfect, and utterly empty. In the car, she stared out the window at Chicago's skyline. I should feel relieved. Should? I won. Preston's gone. The company's secure. Everything I fought for. Victoria's voice was flat. So why do I feel like I'm losing? Dan knew the answer but couldn't say it out loud. Because winning meant going back. Back to her empty penthouse, her 80-hour work weeks, her life of careful control that never let anyone close enough to matter. And Dan would go back too, back to his 2-bedroom apartment and his 3 jobs and his careful invisibility. They picked Emma up from school together, perhaps for the last time. Emma chattered about her art project, a painting of their family standing in front of a castle. 3 stick figures, carefully labeled in wobbly preschool handwriting. Daddy, Emma, Victoria. At the penthouse, Emma ran to her room to add more details to her castle drawing. Victoria stood in the kitchen, still wearing her boardroom armor, looking lost in her own home. I should start packing, Dan ventured. Victoria's response came too quickly. You don't have to leave tonight. The agreement was until the deal closed. Right, the agreement. Victoria pulled off her wedding ring, the fake one they'd bought at a jewelry store for the appearance of legitimacy. She held it out. Thank you for your service. Dan didn't take the ring. Victoria, please don't make this harder. Her voice cracked. You helped me. I'm grateful. Now we both go back to our real lives. What if I don't want to? The words surprised them both. Victoria stared at him, the ring still balanced on her palm. Dan pushed forward. What if I don't want to go back? What if the last 3 weeks, the fake marriage and shared apartment and playing house, what if that felt more real than anything in my life has felt in 3 years? You're confused. You've been through trauma. We both have. Victoria was retreating into logic, building walls. Sometimes people bond during crisis. It doesn't mean, don't. Dan caught her hand, the one holding the ring. Don't rationalize this. Don't make it smaller than it is. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. You don't want this. You don't want me. I'm complicated and damaged, and my life is never going to be normal. Dan thought about Sarah, about the hospital, about 3 years of carrying guilt that was never really his to carry. I watched my wife die in a hospital room while our daughter colored pictures in the waiting room. Normal left my life a long time ago. He took the ring from Victoria's palm and slipped it back onto her finger. I'm not looking for normal. I'm looking for real. And you're the most real thing I've found. Victoria threw her arms around him, and Dan caught her, held her while she cried against his shoulder. Emma appeared in the doorway, concerned. Why is Victoria sad? Dan pulled back enough to see Emma's worried face. She's not sad, sweetheart. Sometimes people cry when they're happy, too. Are you happy, Victoria? Victoria wiped her eyes, laughing through tears. Yeah, little one, I think I am. Emma considered this seriously. Does that mean we don't have to go home? The question hung there, innocent and devastating. Home. Where was home now? The apartment Dan had shared with Sarah, haunted by memory? The penthouse that had felt empty until a 4-year-old filled it with laughter? Victoria knelt down to Emma's eye level. Would you want to stay? Even though we don't have to pretend anymore? I like it here, and I like you. Emma's logic was simple, pure. Can we stay? Dan looked at Victoria, saw her hope and fear warring in her expression. We can't build something real on a foundation of lies. We need to do this right. What's right? We date, like normal people. Dan was making this up as he went. I moved back to my apartment. You stay here. We have dinners and go to parks and figure out if this is real or if it's just crisis making us feel things that won't last. Victoria stood slowly. How long? As long as it takes. Emma frowned. But I like my room here. I know, baby, but sometimes you have to go slower to make sure you get where you're going. Saturday morning, Dan packed his and Emma's belongings back into his Honda. Victoria helped, her movements stiff with suppressed emotion. The penthouse already felt too empty with half of Emma's toys loaded into boxes. They'd been here less than 3 weeks, but somehow the space had reshaped itself around their presence. Mrs. Chen was waiting at Dan's apartment building, arms crossed, expression skeptical. "So, how'd it go?" "It's complicated, Linda. Life's complicated. You love her?" Dan paused with a box of Emma's stuffed animals. "I think so. Maybe. I don't know." Linda shook her head. "You know, you're just scared." That evening, after Emma was asleep in her old room, Dan's apartment felt wrong. Too small, too quiet, too much like going backward. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "I missed the noise already." He typed back, "Give it time." "How much time?" "As much as we need." 2 weeks passed in strange limbo. Dan returned to his full schedule at the Grand Meridian, where Marcus Sullivan greeted him with a bone-crushing hug and $50 in cash. "Poker debt," Marcus explained, "plus interest for making me wait." The maintenance crew treated Dan like a returning hero, asking questions about Preston's arrest, about Victoria, about what it was like living in a penthouse. Tommy from electrical wanted to know if the shower fixtures were as fancy as they looked in magazines. Rodriguez from plumbing offered unsolicited advice about relationships with rich women, all of it useless, but well-meaning. Dan worked and came home to Emma and tried to pretend his life made sense, but everything felt off-kilter. Emma asked about Victoria constantly. When would they see her? Could they video call? Did Victoria miss them too? Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after moving out, Dan's phone rang with Victoria's number. "Would you like to have coffee?" His heart jumped. "Just coffee?" "Just coffee. Emma's with Mrs. Chen." "Yeah, she's teaching Emma how to make dumplings." "Okay, there's a place near you, Lakeview Cafe. 20 minutes?" The cafe was small and comfortable, the kind of neighborhood spot where regulars knew the staff by name. Victoria was already there when Dan arrived, sitting at a corner table in jeans and a Northwestern sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked younger this way, more accessible, less like the CEO, and more like the woman who'd collapsed in his arms crying. "Hi." "Hi." Dan slid into the seat across from her. They ordered coffee. The barista brought it with a knowing smile, like she could sense the tension between them. Dan wrapped his hands around the warm mug, grateful for something to do with them. Victoria spoke first. "How's Emma?" "She misses you, asks about you every day." "I miss her too." Victoria's voice was soft. "Just her?" "Not just her." They both smiled, some of the awkwardness dissolving. Dan studied her face, noting the shadows under her eyes were lighter now, the tension in her jaw less pronounced. She looked like someone who'd finally put down a heavy weight. "I don't know how to do this," Victoria admitted. "Date someone. Have a relationship that isn't about business or strategy or control. I don't know how to date a CEO billionaire." "So we're both figuring it out." "Yeah." They talked for 2 hours about Emma's new obsession with dinosaurs, about Sterling Capital's restructuring post-Preston, about Sarah and how Dan was finally considering grief counseling, about Victoria's father, who'd apologized for not protecting her sooner. They talked about nothing and everything, and when Dan walked Victoria to her car, he kissed her because he wanted to, not because anyone was watching. The kiss was different this time, slower, real. When they pulled apart, Victoria was smiling. "Can we do this again?" "I'd like that." 3 weeks later, Victoria came to Dan's apartment for dinner. Emma had insisted on helping cook, which meant the kitchen was a disaster of flour and tomato sauce. They made pasta from scratch. The three of them working together in the tiny space, bumping elbows and laughing when Emma's noodle dough stuck to the ceiling. Victoria was terrible at cooking, but game to try. She burned the garlic bread twice and oversalted the sauce, but Emma declared it the best dinner ever and insisted Victoria sit next to her. After dinner, they colored together while Dan cleaned up, watching them through the kitchen doorway. This felt right. Not perfect, not magazine cover beautiful, but real, messy and chaotic and filled with the kind of life that mattered. Later, after Emma was in bed, Victoria helped Dan finish the dishes. Standing at the sink, their shoulders touching, Victoria spoke quietly. "This is your real life." "I know. 2-bedroom apartment, pasta from a box, secondhand furniture." Dan turned to face her. "Is that a problem?" "No." Victoria's eyes were bright. I just want to make sure you understand. If this continues, if we make this real, my life isn't going to change much. I'll still work 80-hour weeks sometimes. I'll still have board meetings and investor calls and business trips. And I'll still work maintenance and take night classes for my engineering degree. Dan had enrolled the week before, finally pursuing the education he'd abandoned when Sarah got pregnant. I'll still drive a beat-up Honda and live in a small apartment. So where does that leave us? Dan took her hands. It leaves us figuring it out together. No more pretending, no more fake marriages or strategic arrangements. Just us, trying to build something real. Victoria kissed him, soft and certain. When she left that night, Emma called from her bedroom. Daddy, is Victoria your girlfriend now? Dan sat on the edge of Emma's bed. Would that be okay with you? Emma nodded solemnly. She makes you smile. And she doesn't get mad when I make mistakes. Why would she get mad at mistakes? Mommy didn't get mad either. Good moms don't get mad at mistakes. Dan's throat tightened. Emma was comparing Victoria to Sarah, giving her the highest compliment a 4-year-old knew how to give. Victoria's not your mom, honey. But she could be my friend who's like a mom. Yeah, baby, she could be. 2 months into their real relationship, James Sterling requested lunch with Dan. The invitation came through Victoria, who looked equal parts amused and concerned. He wants to get to know the man dating his daughter. His words, not mine. The restaurant was predictably expensive, the kind of place where the menu didn't list prices. Dan wore his interview suit, the one he'd bought for job applications he'd never submitted, and tried not to feel completely out of place. James Sterling was exactly as imposing as Dan remembered. Silver hair, shrewd eyes, the bearing of someone who'd built an empire through sheer force of will. He ordered for both of them without asking Dan's preference, which might have been insulting except the food turned out to be excellent. Mr. Carter, you and Victoria have been seeing each other for several weeks now. Yes, sir. And before that, you helped her with the Preston situation. Dan chose his words carefully. I did what anyone should do when someone needs help. Most people wouldn't have. James cut into his steak with surgical precision. Most people would have walked away from that mess. Too complicated, too dangerous. But you stayed. Yes, sir. James studied him for a long moment. We do. Dan thought about that first night, Victoria seizing his collar in the Grand Meridian lobby. Because she looked at me like I was a person. Not furniture, not invisible. Just a person who could help. And because nobody should have to face their worst fears alone. You lost your wife 3 years ago. It wasn't a question. James had clearly done his homework. Car accident, March 15, 2021. And you believe Preston Blackwood was involved. His shell company hired the driver who killed her. Whether he personally ordered it, Dan shrugged. The FBI's still investigating. Either way, Sarah's gone. Nothing brings her back. James set down his fork. You could sue. Preston's assets will be liquidated. You'd have a strong civil case, especially if the criminal case finds conspiracy. I could. Dan met the older man's gaze. But money won't bring Sarah back. And I've got Emma to think about. She needs stability, not years of litigation and courtroom drama. Most men would take the money. I'm not most men, and I don't want Victoria thinking I'm with her because of what she can give me. James smiled, the first genuine expression Dan had seen from him. You really care about my daughter. I do. She told me about Emma, about how the girl calls looking for Victoria when she has nightmares now. Dan nodded. Emma had started video calling Victoria at bedtime, needing to see her face before sleeping. Victoria always answered no matter what meeting she was in. Dating Victoria means photographers and media attention and scrutiny, James continued. Your daughter will grow up in that spotlight. Every school event, every birthday party, every mistake will be documented and analyzed. Are you prepared for that? Dan had thought about this. I spent 3 years trying to be invisible, making myself small, keeping Emma safe by keeping us hidden. But you know what I learned? James waited. Being invisible didn't keep us safe. It just kept us lonely. Dan's voice was steady. Victoria makes me want to stop hiding. She makes me feel like existing that isn't something to apologize for. James nodded slowly. My daughter deserves someone who sees her. Not the CEO, not the money, not the power. Someone who sees Victoria and chooses her anyway. I do see her, and I choose her every day. The rest of lunch passed in easier conversation. James asked about Dan's engineering courses, his work at the Grand Meridian, his plans for Emma's education. By the time they finished, Dan felt like he'd passed some invisible test. As they left the restaurant, James offered his hand. "You're good for her, Daniel. Don't screw it up." "I'll do my best, sir." 3 months into dating, Victoria called Dan in a panic. The main HVAC system at Sterling Capital had failed during a crucial investor presentation. The building was heating up fast, the backup system wasn't engaging, and the building's regular maintenance team couldn't diagnose the problem. "I know it's insane to call you," Victoria's voice was tight with stress, "but they're saying it'll take hours to get a specialist here, and we've got 200 people in the conference room. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Dan arrived with his toolbox to find Sterling Capital's lobby in controlled chaos. Employees fanning themselves, visitors looking annoyed, and Victoria's assistant directing people to rooms with working air conditioning. Victoria met him at the service elevator, her professional mask firmly in place but relief visible in her eyes. "Thank you for coming. Let's see what we've got." The HVAC control room was in the basement, a maze of pipes and electrical panels and diagnostic readouts that would overwhelm most people. Dan spent 5 minutes analyzing the system, tracing connections, checking temperatures and pressures. Rodriguez from the Grand Meridian had taught him a trick. Listen to the machines. They'll tell you what's wrong if you pay attention. Dan pressed his ear against the main compressor unit, heard the irregular rhythm that meant something was forcing the motor to work harder than it should. "Your thermostat's in emergency heat mode," Dan explained to the building's maintenance tech, a young guy who looked both embarrassed and grateful for the help. "Someone said it wrong, probably during last week's testing. The system's trying to heat a building that's already warm, so it's overloaded the compressor." 20 minutes later, Dan had reset the system, adjusted the thermostats, and checked the backup systems to ensure they had engaged properly if needed. Cool air began flowing through the vents. Victoria's investors wouldn't even know there'd been a problem. Victoria appeared in the doorway as Dan was packing his tools. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing." "Dan, I helped because you needed help. Not everything's a transaction." Victoria stepped into the small mechanical room, letting the door close behind them. "You just saved a $50 million deal. The least I can do is—" Dan kissed her, stopping the words. When he pulled back, Victoria was smiling. "That's not appropriate payment for skilled labor," she managed. "Consider it a boyfriend perk." Behind them, the young maintenance tech cleared his throat awkwardly. Miss Sterling? The investors are asking when you're coming back?" Victoria straightened, CEO mask sliding back into place, but her hand found Dan's, squeezing once before she let go. "Tell them 5 minutes." That evening, Victoria showed up at Dan's apartment without calling first. Emma was already in pajamas, brushing her teeth before bed. Victoria looked different, determined, her movements purposeful as she set her bag down. "I've been thinking." Dan waited, recognizing the tone. This was CEO Victoria, the one who made decisions and expected them to be executed. "We've been dating for 3 months, taking it slow, doing things the right way, and it's been good, really good. But I'm tired of going home to an empty apartment every night. I'm tired of saying goodnight to Emma over video calls. I'm tired of slow." Emma appeared in the bathroom doorway, toothbrush still in her mouth. "Victoria!" Victoria laughed, kneeling down to hug Emma despite the toothpaste risk. "Hi, little one." After Dan had tucked Emma into bed, he found Victoria pacing his small living room. "Move in with me, you and Emma, for real this time." Dan's heart hammered. "Victoria, I know we said we'd take it slow, but slow was to make sure this was real, and I know it's real now." Victoria's words came fast, like she'd been rehearsing them. "I love you. I love Emma. I want to wake up with you every morning and argue about whose turn it is to make breakfast and help Emma with homework. You want us to move in. I want you to stay, not because I need protection or because of some agreement, because I choose you, because you make my apartment feel like home." Dan crossed to her, taking her hands. Emma needs stability. If we do this and it doesn't work, it'll work. Victoria's voice was fierce. We'll make it work, because I'm not giving up on this. On us. Dan thought about the past 3 months, about coffee dates and dinners and the way Victoria fit into their lives like she'd always been there. About Emma calling for Victoria when she had nightmares. About Victoria answering every time. About standing in a small kitchen, doing dishes together, and feeling more complete than he had in 3 years. Okay, Victoria blinked. Okay? Yeah, let's do it. Let's move in, for real this time. Victoria kissed him hard, both of them smiling against each other's lips. Behind them, Emma's small voice called out, "Does this mean I get my castle room back?" They both laughed. "Yeah, bae," Dan called back. "You get your castle room back." A year and a half after that first night in the Grand Meridian lobby, Daniel Carter and Victoria Sterling stood in Grant Park under an arbor decorated with late spring flowers. 50 guests watched as Judge Roberts, the same judge who'd processed their hasty first marriage at the courthouse, officiated their real wedding. Emma stood between them in a pink dress, holding their rings on a small cushion. She took her role as ring bearer very seriously, having practiced for weeks. Dan's vows came from the heart. "A year and a half ago, you grabbed my collar and asked me to pretend. I'm done pretending. You're brilliant and strong and stubborn, and you make me want to be brave. I love you. For real." Victoria's voice shook slightly but held steady. "You taught me that strength isn't about control, it's about letting people in. You and Emma gave me a family I didn't know I needed. I love you, for real." Judge Roberts smiled. "Emma, do you accept Victoria as your family?" Emma's response was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, but can I call you Mom now?" Victoria's careful composure crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she knelt to Emma's level. "Yes, please." The reception was small, held in the private room of a restaurant Victoria's family had frequented for generations. Marcus Sullivan attended with Tommy and Rodriguez, the maintenance crew uncomfortable in suits, but beaming with genuine happiness for Dan. James Sterling gave a toast about second chances and choosing love over fear. Mrs. Chen cried through the entire ceremony and gave Victoria a jade bracelet that had belonged to her own mother. Later, as they danced their first dance as a real married couple, Victoria whispered, "No regrets? Not even one. Not even that I dragged you into a mess with a criminal ex-fiancé?" Dan pulled her closer. "Especially not that." 6 months after the wedding, Preston Blackwood was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, plus $75 million in fines and restitution. The charges: wire fraud, embezzlement, computer fraud, conspiracy. The investigation into Sarah's death remained open, the driver having pleaded guilty to vehicular manslaughter, but refused to implicate Preston directly. Dan made peace with the ambiguity. Sarah was gone, but Emma was thriving. That had to be enough. Sterling Capital grew 40% in the year following Preston's arrest. The Grant Morrison partnership exceeded projections. Victoria was named CEO of the Year by 3 different business publications. Dan finished his engineering degree through night classes and took a position as facilities manager at Sterling Capital, overseeing the building systems he'd once fixed as a contractor. Emma started first grade at a private school near the penthouse, making friends easily and excelling in art class. She called Victoria Mom without hesitation now, though they'd had long conversations about Sarah and how Emma could love 2 mothers without betraying either one. One Saturday morning, exactly 2 years after that first night at the Grand Meridian, Dan and Victoria sat in the family court listening to Judge Martinez review their adoption petition. Emma sat between them, swinging her legs and coloring a picture of their family. "Emma, do you understand what adoption means?" Emma looked up from her drawing. "It means Victoria becomes my real mom, legally and everything." "That's right. She'll be responsible for you, love you, take care of you." "She already does that." Judge Martinez smiled. "I hereby grant the petition for adoption. Emma Carter is now legally Emma Carter Sterling." Emma jumped up, hugging Victoria so hard they both nearly fell over. Dan watched them, thinking about Sarah and how she would have loved Victoria, how she would have wanted Emma to have this. The guilt he'd carried for 3 years had finally loosened its grip, replaced by something gentler. Gratitude for what he'd had and what he'd found again. That evening, they returned to the Grand Meridian for Sterling Capital's annual Christmas gala. Full circle, Dan thought, as they walked through the same lobby where this had all started. The marble floors still gleamed under amber lights, the same Christmas decorations reflecting off polished surfaces. Emma ran ahead to the children's activities area the hotel had set up, leaving Dan and Victoria standing near the spot where she'd first grabbed his collar. "Do you ever regret it?" Victoria asked. That night, Dan pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her perfume. "Never, not for a second. I basically assaulted you in a public lobby. You asked for help. I chose to give it." Victoria leaned against him, her professional CEO mask nowhere in evidence. "I was so scared that night. I thought I was losing everything. And instead, I found everything." Victoria looked up at him. "You, Emma, a family, a life that feels real instead of performed." Marcus Sullivan appeared, bringing Tommy and Rodriguez with him. The maintenance crew had been invited as Dan's guests, and they were clearly enjoying the fancy atmosphere while also making fun of it. "Danny," Marcus pulled him into a hug. "Look at you, all fancy now. Facilities manager. Still remember how to fix a toilet? I could take you in a plumbing contest any day, old man." "That's what I like to hear." Marcus nodded respectfully to Victoria. "Mrs. Carter Sterling, thanks for taking care of our boy." Victoria smiled. "He takes care of me just as much." "That's how it should be." Marcus clapped Dan on the shoulder. "That's what family does. We take care of each other." Emma ran back breathless and excited. "Mom, Dad, they have hot chocolate with marshmallows." Victoria and Dan exchanged glances. Mom and Dad never got old. "Can we get some?" "Of course." Emma grabbed both their hands, pulling them toward the refreshment table. They walked through the glittering lobby, a family of three, whole and happy, exactly where it had all begun. Dan thought about that first night, about Victoria's desperate kiss and her frantic request for help, about his decision to say yes when every logical reason screamed no, about how sometimes the best choices are the ones you make with your heart instead of your head. 2 years ago, he had been invisible, surviving but not living. Now he was a husband again, a father to a thriving daughter, part of a community that supported him and a relationship that challenged and sustained him in equal measure. He'd built a career he was proud of, pursuing the engineering degree he'd abandoned years ago. He had friends and family and a life that mattered, all because one desperate woman had grabbed his collar and asked for 10 minutes of his time. Victoria leaned close, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "Thank you for saying yes that night." Dan kissed her temple. "Thank you for asking." They reached the refreshment table where Emma was already chatting with the server about marshmallow quantities. The Grand Meridian hummed around them, wealthy and powerful people conducting their business and building their networks. But Dan and Victoria only had eyes for their daughter and each other. Sometimes, Dan thought, the best answer is the one that makes no logical sense, the one that breaks your careful plans and disrupts your controlled life, the one that asks you to be brave when you've spent years being safe. Sometimes you just have to say yes and trust that love will figure out the details. Emma turned around with 3 cups of hot chocolate, her face glowing with joy. Victoria took her cup, Dan took his, and they toasted together in the middle of the lobby where it had all started. "To family," Victoria proposed. "To second chances," Dan added. "To hot chocolate," Emma finished, making them both laugh. They drank together, the warmth spreading through Dan's chest having nothing to do with the beverage. This was home, not the penthouse or the apartment or any physical location. Home was standing in a hotel lobby with the people who'd chosen him and who he'd chosen back, building something real from the ashes of what they'd lost. The future stretched ahead, unknowable and slightly terrifying, but Dan wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. That was enough. That was everything.